Welcome. Look at there's stuck on
It's
my
so good to
lip.
see your face.
It's so good to see your face. I haven't, you guys, we are like not far apart in
No.
geography, but I haven't seen her the whole time I've been in California, and it
Be
makes
up
me
there
sad.
soon.
Yeah, as we talk about mental health, you're good for my mental health. You are.
Aw, you're
You're
good
good
for.
for.
Can you
Yes.
hear me okay? I have kind of like a weird setup
Yes,
happening.
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay.
Um. Woo. We were just talking. I had just started discussing how we need to have more open conversations and less shame around talking about mental health and saying that we are struggling.
Yeah.
But somebody had mentioned in the comments how children, like the lack of like music in schools and the lack of things is affecting the rates, and that directly parallels to the lack of funding in
Yes.
in schools.
Well, here's the really sad part of that is that there's not actually a lack of funding. There's like a misappropriation of funding in schools. And, you know this, but your followers probably don't. I worked at two different schools in East Oakland, running a trauma-informed creative writing program. And the first school that I worked at, called Roots International Academy, was shut down. Um, and the second school, all of our arts programs were defunded in 2019. And then that school is also being merged with another school. So the pattern you'll see in Oakland especially is that the charter schools have used a loophole. Sorry, I don't need to get onto the whole rant about it, but the point
You
is
can. You can.
there's plenty of funding for the schools in the like wealthier, predominantly white areas, and the schools in the like black and brown neighborhoods, poorer areas are being defunded, and it is kind of nefarious because they'll use little things like attendance or behavioral issues or whatever, and a lot of times it's not it's not behavioral issues like these kids are being bad kids. A lot of times what we code as behavioral issues are often like symptoms of mental health issues, or symptoms of an institutional problem like students' needs not being met in the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
their IEPs not being recognized, their teachers not having the resources to educate them in the way that they really need to be educated. And so if there's a school with lower test scores or lower attendance, and higher, behavioral issue codings, which is like, when there's you do a code or whatever for when like expulsions or suspensions, things like that, then those are the schools that get defunded. And funding in Oakland, at least in OUSD, is directly tied to attendance. So that if there's a kid who has to go to the hospital with their mom every day at 5 o'clock in the morning so that she can get dialysis, that student might not make it to school on time. That counts towards attendance and funding. So it's all a very, I believe it's a very nefarious cycle because these issues are known. They're not new. They're not a secret. It's not like some kind of mystery. This is something that the people funding the schools know about. It's something that has been very well established, and yet it's still the way that they can kind of get around saying, oh, this isn't racist, this isn't classist, whatever. This is an ableist, this is just based on performance or whatever. So, and they can get away with it. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I love it. I love your TED Talk. What I wonder is, coming from like the education background, like do you see a solution to this with, like, do we need to switch how we are funding schools, so that, do we need to have more counselors in schools so that they notice these things, so that they're not being punished for being late, they're being like helped like with like what is
Yeah.
the solution? Do you have any?
A lot of these solutions are already in place. And if you look at the Black Panther Party in like the 1960s, they actually came up with some of these solutions and then were absolutely demonized by the American government and targeted with wiretapping and murdered. A lot of the leaders. But they set up their own community schools because they were like, you know, the public school system is not educating our children. And they fed people. They like had all of this community outreach that came from within the community. And we have a lot of that too here in Oakland. And I think that this problem, and also this is obviously not just an Oakland problem. This school funding situation is happening all over the country. And one of the big things that I think contributes to this and is pretty well agreed on contributes to this is charter schools are a huge complicated issue, but let me give you an example of Oakland. In OUSD, charter schools are taking advantage of, well, let me back up and say that a lot of charter schools are funded by large charter corporations.
Okay.
And you know, there are many different reasons that they benefit from starting these schools. Tax breaks, they get federal funding, they get local funding, and it's, yeah, like a tax shield. And then another thing that I was talking about with some people in the community recently is that I was noticing on Zillow, if you go look on Zillow in the area, the housing prices are like going way up in this area where our poorest students live. And one of the schools, you know, there's like a number rating next to the schools in the area. And one of the schools had jumped up from like 1 to like a 6. And that's because it was a charter school that had come in. And that's the most local high school, the closest high school. So when you drive up artificially, because the charter schools are artificially driving up statistics in their own schools, and there's no oversight for it, and they're not even, they don't have open school board meetings, they have separate school boards. So these charter schools can sort of drive up property prices as well. Now, don't like quote me on that. That's just something that has been brewing in my head recently. I've not looked up statistics on that, or, you know, I can't fact. But when charter schools are established in Oakland, it's very hard to shut them down or to like not have them be approved by the school board. They're taking advantage of a like 20 or 30-year-old loophole in Oakland laws that allows them to have equal access to public school funding and property, equal access to public school property. So they are actually siphoning funds from our public schools, while in many cases being able to raise like $1 million a year through their PTA rating, while also being funded by these larger corporations like Netflix or, you know, Amazon, have their own like charter shells that they sort of either have started or siphon a lot of money into. So they're funded in all these different ways. Some of the charter schools we're seeing were applying for the small business loans, even though they're schools, because they have this shady ground of also being businesses, you know? So that's, I think, a huge part of the problem. And a lot of wealthy white people are for charter schools because they want to have control over like the education of their students, of their paying for private school. So the long and short of it, and this is a very complicated issue that I'm consolidating into like a very quick and dirty explanation, is that charter schools are a huge part of the problem. People can cite to you probably a lot of, I've heard it a lot, different charter schools that are doing well or that they, you know, that people support or whatever. But, and I'm sure that's true. I know of one that actually just, I think, shut down, that was doing kind of okay in Oakland in terms of like serving our Black and brown youth. But if you look at Oakland specifically, the charter schools have resegregated the school system in a very extreme way. And they are serving a really large white population, whereas the school that I taught at, for example, had 0 white students. All of our students were Black, Latinx, Middle Eastern, or Asian Pacific Islander. So it's a really complicated issue. Our school had a lot of mental health support, but it wasn't enough. We had social work interns who came and worked at our school. We had several counselors. We had counseling enriched classes. We had a music program. We had my charter, or sorry, I'm reading the comments while I'm trying to talk.
Yeah, no problem.
My my trauma-informed creative writing program, which, like, you know, for the just for the sake of my students, in case any of the students who went to my school are on this call, and for everybody's privacy, not everybody who was in my classes was diagnosed with trauma or PTSD. There were many different, it was like a very diverse in terms of mental health classroom. The idea of trauma informed is that if there is somebody who has trauma, and many of our students and many people in general are not diagnosed as having PTSD or any sort of trauma reaction, but and I believe all classrooms should be set up this way. My classroom was set up so that if somebody did have trauma, they would be able to take the class, and it was dynamic and worked around the needs of the students as they arose. So, and also trauma-informed education, in my experience as somebody who has also a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is ADHD, trauma-informed education often works well for students who have ADHD as well.
It does. What would your, now with a lot of like schools not opening and it being like they're being taught at home and through homeschool, what do you feel now? Because a lot of the public schools, especially in lower income or minority communities, already have they don't have the funding. So how are these kids, how are we noticing their traumas, or their, like, how are they going to experience like a class like yours from home? Like,
they can't, I mean, well, all right, sorry, I don't mean to point blank. This is
I'm just trying to understand, like, how, like, I feel like COVID is directly, yes, in terms of education and things, like they're not getting the education they need, but they're also not getting any of the help they need.
Yeah.
While a whole movement is going on that is so triggering and horrific for a child.
It's a whole mess. Somebody here is saying that it's up to the teachers to do daily check-ins, which that is true. And unfortunately, that is a difficult responsibility to put on the teachers because, for example, in the case, as is the case with a lot of students coming from this kind of background, a lot of our students have not been, we've not been able to get in touch with them. And I say I'm not actually working in the schools anymore as of our program being closed. But I have been in contact with all of our old teachers. And, you know, there's some resources issues. I mean, our students weren't even given computers until a month into the pandemic. Those weren't distributed. And now OUSD just announced that instead of giving students computers, you know, distributed within the first 3 weeks of school starting, which is like the middle of August is when school starts, it's a couple weeks away. They said it's going to be within the first 2 months. So these students are somehow supposed to access their education without computers or any way to get in touch with their teachers, that's just such an enormous failure, in my opinion, on the part of OUSD. And I've been very involved in like going to board meetings, and we had our strike in 2019. It feels like 17 years ago, but it was last year. But you know, we have, you know, a lot of students who are houseless, And if you are living in a shelter, and I haven't double checked on this, so please fact check me, but my understanding was that a lot of local shelters require you to leave during the day. And I don't know if there is a change that has happened because of the pandemic and they're not forcing people to leave during the day, but a lot of our students, don't have access to the internet, or they do have the hotspots that have been passed out, but the internet is very spotty.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody on here, Gil North, said they pushed for cell numbers for parents when they didn't have access to their students, which is a great solution. Our parents change their cell phone numbers often. So I've actually, because I am no longer working for the school system, I can reach out to my students on Instagram, my former students. So sometimes people will like back channel me and be like, I cannot get in touch with so-and-so's, parent, none of these numbers that I have, and we'll often have multiple numbers in our records. None of them are working. And there's lots of reasons that are really valid that people change their numbers. But so I've reached out to students on Instagram before and had success with that. But the point is, we are a school that is so understaffed. I keep saying we. Let me reiterate that I don't work for the school anymore, but I still feel part of the community, and I've been working at the food bank. I stay involved. But we have we're understaffed, underfunded, and we don't have, like I said, enough counselors. And a lot of the teachers that we get are Teach for America teachers, first-year teachers, and they're already overwhelmed just in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And we have some really talented educators as well that work at our school, but everybody is just overtapped, and there's a million other issues involved in that I won't get into out of the sake of, like, I don't know, the privacy of
Yeah.
people that I worked with. But there's not a simple solution to this, and the point is that whenever you have already there are issues of poverty, racism, mental health, ableism, all of this is it all shows in the school system in the first place. When you throw something like a pandemic into the mix, it absolutely widens this already existing enormous gap. So I'm seeing reports of, like, sort of middle class families forming pods together,
Yeah.
and like everybody goes over to somebody's house or whatever, and they do homeschooling together, which is a great idea. But then when you have, like, a family where, like, a parent has to work 2 or 3 jobs, and or where there's like housing insecurity, or not enough access to technology and the internet, how do we do that? And we've been talking too about with I already mentioned that students who don't have housing don't have a place necessarily to do their work.
Yeah.
Libraries are closed. The places they would normally go are closed. And so our school community manager was trying to find a way to get students who don't have housing priority to come to school in a socially distanced way and do their work there, because the schools were talking about doing like a very soft reopening, and they were prioritizing students that had separate roles, like special education students or newcomer students.
Yeah.
And she's trying to get the students who don't have housing onto that list as well. It doesn't look like any of that is happening. So then we still have this issue that we need a solution for, which is how do we get a place for students who don't have housing to actually be able to access their work and do their work, and have access to their education. So hi, Sean. So I have been trying to brainstorm with a couple different people. I know other people are working on this as well. There are a lot of people who are really invested in this. But when you have, a huge shutdown like this, where do you go? And how do you address these issues of equity? And
That's where I have been watching And I have a lot of friends that are teachers and people in education. And I go, for myself, we're shut down. So I have to do so much work to figure out how to get this information, how to go to therapy, how to do this.
Yeah.
And I have access
Yeah.
to all of that. So when you have children and the parents are already strapped, and then the structure was already a mess to begin with, and then now the structure's gone.
Mm-hmm.
I just see huge problems with many communities. I see it a lot in the Bay Area. I see it a lot in LA, mainly because that's where I have so many roots and I have a lot of connections. But I feel that way in Nashville as well. There's the private schools and there's charter schools, and then there are the public schools, which are horrible for the most part to say. And the kids that go to them, um, they are slipping, and
Yeah.
not by their own fault. And I think this is the time when we need more, even if school was going on like normal, we need more money going to it. We need more access for these kids because there is a pandemic which has a mental health component in it. Just the pandemic alone for every race.
Yeah.
And then you think about, there is Black Lives Matter. There are kids on Instagram and on Facebook, and or even if they have access to the internet, they're seeing images that they don't know how to process. They don't know
Well,
how.
I say like one really amazing thing that has given me a lot of hope and continues to, and it shouldn't have to, and I like, well, I'll get to that after I say what I'm about to say, but um a lot of these movements are student led, and what I found was that our Gen Z students, our middle schoolers that we taught, have been radicalized, and they've gotten really politically involved, and they're going to the school board meetings. They were leading the chants at the strike, the teacher strike last year. They are uh, organizing and leading a lot of the protests here in the Bay Area, huge protests led by the youth. So, you know, they're not taking this sitting down. And I know that our students are very well versed in the history of racism in this country, the history of racism in the education system. And you know, so they are activated and they're active, and they shouldn't have to be. That's what I was gonna
That's
say.
what's sad.
Shouldn't,
I mean, I'm happy that they are.
yeah.
And in Nashville, they are too. The Teens for Equality led one of the biggest protests in Nashville during a pandemic. I was so proud that they were 14 girls that were thousands, like
Yeah.
thousands of people showed up to support
Yeah.
and
They're
to lead. But then you go, we're not putting this on the backs of kids or teens or young, but they're feeling the need for this, which
I do
it
work
saddens me. I mean,
back.
it saddens me that this is where we are in 2020,
Yeah.
that it's
I mean,
on the back of Gen Z.
knowing the history of this country, this just keeps it just keeps happening. I'm not surprised. Systems of power don't let themselves be disassembled easily, and they finding ways to be reorganized, you know. But I do think we're putting this on the backs of our students. I think, you know, a lot of us are taking action and doing what we can, but you know, our whole system has failed these students. And when we're talking about mental health in schools, I mean, that's like a whole other talk probably. I could talk for days about that. But I do think one of the concrete actions that you can take, even if you don't have children, wherever you live and wherever you are voting, go to the school board meetings. Find out when they are, go to them, because the school board can do a lot of action based on, you know, people not paying attention because it's like maybe too low level of politics, or maybe it doesn't affect you if you don't have children, but it does because it affects your community. And the one of the issues there too is that for for us, a lot of these school board members, their campaigns have been funded by the charter schools, or they have affiliations with these charter corporations and charter schools. And so they have a high amount of motivation to, act on the behalf of the charter schools and not act necessarily in the public schools' best interest. And we, at one point after the teacher strike last year, they rescheduled a board meeting for 10 a.m. on Monday that everybody went back to school, thinking that people wouldn't be able to attend the board meeting, because of what was going on. And the reality was that our students skipped school and got together and marched to the board meeting, went into the board meeting. It was like 300 people at this board meeting, mostly students, and got up one at a time and were using their 1 minute to, pretty much, beg the board not to defund these programs that they were trying to defund. A former mayor of Oakland got up there and had also been a board member at some point and was like, I was sitting where you were at one point. I know that you have the money to not defund these programs. Do not defund these programs. And they did anyway. So we're fighting an uphill battle as it is. And so I do think that paying attention to your local politics, paying attention to your local school board, and if your values say that all kids deserve an equal education, then you can attend those board meetings through Zoom. You can write letters to school board. You can do lots of different ways of reaching out and not taking it sitting down, because it is your community, even if you don't have children in school. So
see, I even feel even beyond that. I feel like everybody deserves an equal education, but I actually feel that the public schools deserve more in the minority communities, because they're dealing with more, so they need access to even more than a kid in an upper middle class white community. They don't need the access to every program that they are getting access to, when we need more counselors, we need more of your kind of program for trauma, like those things, because the community itself is still healing. And so to take even more away from them and give it to more privilege is a problem, when they should actually have more. It doesn't even need to be equal. They should have a greater piece of the pie, because they need more of the help to create us to be equal in the end.
Our country has a long history of funding the education of the middle class and white people by stealing from Black and brown and poorer communities. That's just true. And basically, affirmative action exists already for white people in those communities. And there is already enough generational wealth and community wealth in those communities that, for example, in Oakland, again, a lot of, I think something like 90% of, this was before last year, 90% of the libraries in OUSD were closed, which is the highest percentage of libraries closed in anywhere in the country. So that means more libraries in Oakland were closed than in Mississippi. No offense, I was born in Mississippi, but our libraries were shut down already. And Frick, where I worked, had gotten this funding from various sources, including donations from a corporation, but there was this change in funding that had happened a while ago, where they gave library funding to the schools who were not able to raise the money through PTAs first.
Okay.
So the wealthier white communities can raise $1 million a year with their PTA. But our community could not. So we got the funding for our libraries, right? And that funded a librarian, basically, and purchasing books. Well, the school board last year, and this is one of the things they voted on at that meeting that we all stormed, they voted to change that funding so that they gave equal funding to every school in OUSD, which means that every school got like $15,000 or $20,000, maybe 10,000. I don't know the exact amount, but it was not enough to fund a librarian. And our library was shut down as a result of that. And our library had been built up. It was on the news as
Yeah.
the model library for OUSD. You know, it's like a great library, really, really good library. It was a safe space. Kids would go there during lunch. Kids would be like begging to go get books. We had, I don't remember how many, it was something like 5,000 books checked out at one point, and we had like 250 students.
That's amazing.
So we had an amazing library, and it had to be shut down because the funding was redistributed to communities that did not need it. And those communities went up during this board meeting and they were like, do not give us this money. We do not need this money. We have our library. We have funding for it.
Mm-hmm.
We want that money to go to communities that can't raise that money through their PTA. And they didn't listen, and they distributed the money. And who knows why? I can tell you my guesses. You know what they're going to be. But that's part of the issue that's been happening, is that there is just a very complicated political motivation in terms of how funding is distributed, and it's highly problematic. So
well, I look at that even when you give children access to reading and books and knowledge, you give them power to not only heal, but to raise up in the community.
Yeah.
And it is a historical thing that they don't want to give minorities or Blacks or many minorities. Obviously, I focus a lot on Black America, but they don't want to give them that power because then they're afraid they could overwhelm them. When really giving them that power makes our country great. You can't say our country is great when you are taking away knowledge from kids. And that is, children need knowledge. You need to be able to read. You need to be able to access information to be equal. It's very hard to catch up. It's very hard to catch up as you get older. So people go, well, when they're older, they're doing great things. But I'm like, that you just push them behind even further when they already were behind. We're behind generationally.
And
So,
I mean, we have students. Well, I mean, let me just say the reading inequity is real. And also the school to prison pipeline is real. And the United States loves to have a free source of labor.
yes.
And so they are not motivated to change these situations because there's a lot of people profiting egregiously on this school to prison pipeline.
Yes.
And if you can blame students for their own, you know, inequalities and their own educational inequalities, then it's easier to not fix it. It's easier to profit off of them. And that's exactly what's happening. And it's been happening for a long time.
And when you don't allow them to get help, or you don't acknowledge where the pain is coming from, or why somebody has sent to me the other day, they're like, well, if a kid's acting out, they should be punished. I'm like, I don't think that is true. I think if a child is acting out, there's a reason a child is acting out, and they should be spoken with, and we should get to the bottom. Maybe there's something in the home. Maybe there is, like, they haven't been able to eat. Maybe they're homeless. Maybe they're being abused. Maybe they're just scared. Like, maybe they're being teased. Like, there's so many reasons why a kid acts out, quote unquote, as they say. But that does not mean they are trouble. Does not mean they should just be suspended. Does not mean that them not showing up on time should be taken away. Like the extreme behavior that I feel like a lot of school boards and a lot of government officials have towards minority children, and especially using the schools for that, is in direct correlation to wanting them to grow up and not be the citizens that they could respect, so that they can push them into different areas of life.
Let me add a complication to that, because I personally witnessed like little Black girls being punished for acting out when they were answering the question the teacher asked and trying to participate. So there is a huge, another complication to this is that often racism informs the way that some teachers will, and it's not some teachers, it's a pattern,
Yeah.
will discipline students and interpret what students are doing. If a student is yelling out an answer and you say that you discipline them for that, you have to really step back and look at why this particular student is somebody you're disciplining for doing what you asked them to do.
Yeah.
Maybe you wanted her to raise her hand. You can always say, remember, we're going to raise our hands.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to send them out of the classroom for that. So there, and that you can see that in terms of if I think most schools keep records of statistics in terms of not just the major things like suspensions and expulsions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a we did for a while, and we were looking at the racial demographics of
Mm-hmm.
how people were being sent out of the classrooms, and this actually worked pretty well, if I remember correctly. It was under a certain employee of the school who ended up moving on to another school. So I think, I wasn't part of it after that. I don't know if they still did this, but they gathered the data and reviewed it every 6 weeks. And if they saw that a certain, often white teacher was disciplining, Black girls more than anybody else and sending them out of classroom, because we had records of if they were sent out of the classroom, if they had to call home, anything like that, then the assistant principal would go talk to them, and point it out as a problem. So there's a difference between having standards for students, and I think that's another issue of institutional racism as well, is having lower standards based on racism.
Mm-hmm.
And not holding students to high standards in terms of believing that they can achieve learning.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between having high standards of classroom behavior as well versus disciplining students. And I will tell you, in my experience, I am not perfect, and I am, did not do a good job all the time with this, but 100% of the time that a student was acting out, if I found a time to go talk to them later in the day or took them aside and asked what's going on, there was a really serious issue a lot of the time. Sometimes it was just a minor issue, like I'm feeling really anxious, and we would come up with a solution. But there's always a different way to approach it. And part of the problem with having underfunded schools is that if you have a classroom of 30 students and, a bunch of kids are, anxious or feeling traumatized or have, disabilities that are not being addressed, you're not going to be able to go talk to your students and figure out what's going on. You're just going to start sending them out of the classroom.
Yeah.
And that creates an access barrier, and it's that's another part of the multitude and complexity of all of these serious issues. But again, that's where I do think people who don't have kids getting involved in, at least local politics, national politics, all of, finding ways to, if you have time to, sign up to tutor. I think there's Zoom tutoring available.
Yeah,
and, there's different ways that if you are concerned about this, and you should be concerned about it, I think, you can not just stand by the wayside and watch.
And when this is over, I'll post some sources to do that, because I have been tutoring a bit in Nashville through Zoom for one of the smaller schools that I just feel needs some help, and I can do that. And I've been teaching a few little voice lessons for some of the toddlers and children, just to help with music. And I do this for me because I don't have kids, but I want children and I want the education system to be good for my future children. But also when I was in school, I was blessed to go to a great school, and I acted out a lot because I had abuse at home, and I was able to get help. They noticed it. There were people to send me to. There were people interacting with my mom and being like, what's going on? And they saw a pattern of behavior and they're like, there's something wrong with this pattern of behavior. And they caught all of the little markers. And I never felt shamed for it. I never was suspended. And let me tell you, things I should have been suspended for, things that I did were highly inappropriate in elementary and middle school, which showed, but they directly correlated with somebody being like, there's probably abuse somewhere. Like, but there were people educated enough to know that, to catch it. But then again, I went to a majority white school.
Mm-hmm.
I was one of 3 people that I can name the people that were a minority in my school. Like, I know them, I can see their faces. It was heavily funded in an upper middle class white neighborhood. So I benefited from that. And it saddens me that what I experienced was like, I feel like abuse in anything is horrific. But I was
Mm-hmm.
able to get help at 8, 9, 10 years old and realized I was having depression. I was having anxiety. I was grinding my teeth. Like, I went to the dentist. They're like, you're grinding your teeth. There's something wrong. Like, all of those factors that tell and the educators were the ones that pinpointed it at first, were all of these other students, like, they just go unseen.
Yeah.
And teachers are trying. I think some teachers are trying. I don't want to say all, because I think there's a lot of racism. Um, and I think there's a lot of people that are overwhelmed and don't know their own experience. But I think the teachers that are trying, they're not being paid for the amount that they want to help and for the hours that they're trying to help outside of school. And that is where, if you don't have kids, or if you have time, or if you have privilege to, even if you have kids and you have the time to participate, because there are people that are struggling to find the time to just be.
Yeah.
Like, they want to do more, but they don't have the ability, like, because they're
It
full up.
it is a system that is set up to fail, and I will say, I mean, it is a really hard job. It is a really, really hard job. And even just reducing class sizes, adding more counselors, adding more training for teachers sometimes, although that can be kind of tricky because of finding the time in the week to do the trainings. They have to negotiate that through the unions and everything. But you know, resources in general help this situation and take some of the burden off of the teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one issue, of
Mm-hmm.
course. I think it's amazing that your teachers reacted in the way that they did when you were growing.
I,
Um,
I I love my teachers. I still talk to some of them on Facebook and Instagram. Like, I had a really good learning experience, which makes me realize, like, how that affected me as an adult, because I had
yeah,
a great learning experience. And let me tell you, I didn't get great grades because I didn't care. But
yeah,
there was a reason I didn't care. There was a lot of stuff going on.
yeah,
And these teachers, a few of them, I ate lunch in their classrooms, and
mm-hmm.
they they helped me. One is her name was Miss Damon, and I still talk to her on Facebook, and she allowed me to be a kid.
Yeah,
She allowed me to cry, and I felt no judgment. But she also was like, what else do you need? What else do you need? I had another teacher that gave me my prom dress because I was really overweight, and she found a prom dress for me, and she knew my mom was working a lot, and not that we couldn't afford it, just that feeling of like, that's what I feel like a community does. And I
yeah,
feel we don't allow that to happen in places that are, we don't allow us to see it. People don't want to see that kind of pain. Like, I
yeah,
think even other parents wouldn't have known the feeling I got. Like, the experience I got in that school is probably very different than a white girl at my school, but it saved me. and it allowed me to go to college, and it allowed me to do these kind of things. But I was encouraged,
You
and I
know,
got help. I was
I,
encouraged over and over again. There were no stupid questions, and I appreciate that chapter in my life, but I think it is very rare. And I had no friends, so it's not like I was popular in high school. My friends were the teachers, so because I was a mess. I was a mess, and I went through a lot of therapy
you
to
know, my own
unmess
students.
myself up. But
Yeah.
but thankful for therapy. Like I was like thankful that people, and thankful that I had access to it.
Yeah.
That's what I
Well,
think. And my mom was very active in the school board and very active in knowing, in listening and knowing how to get things across. Um, and I think that's where I urge people to even know who's on your school board. The amount of
yes.
people that don't know who's on the school board, local is what changes the world. If you don't fix the local area and you don't fix your schools and all the micro stuff, like we can
Mhm.
focus on the macro, we can focus on Trump and all of this, but
And I will
budgeting
say,
small.
I think, from what I've seen just in Oakland, um, it's starting to feel like it's starting to become more of an uphill battle to even change local politics because
Mm-hmm.
people have not been paying attention for kind of a long time to
Yeah,
local politics, so they can sort of, pass more and more different little measures, and make decisions, without people even really knowing about it. And
yeah.
then when you try to start to make a difference, I keep seeing like COVID bangs in the in the video. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. When you try
It's
to make a difference, and that's been going on for, it's more of an uphill battle. But
mm-hmm.
you know, I I I'm thinking of my own experience as a kid who had ADHD, growing up in the South, and my school, the elementary school I went to, and we lived in North Carolina, had similar demographics to the school that I teach at, or that I taught at, and there wasn't a lot of resources, and there was a lot of like really
Mm-hmm.
shame-inducing discipline,
Yeah.
and I was a really good kid. Like I was afraid to be bad at all. And I was disciplined all the time, and I was always in trouble for literally like not knowing what was going on or not paying
Mm-hmm.
attention, ability that was not being addressed in any way.
Yeah.
And I that ADHD is still treated in a similar way to the way that it was when I was growing up. And I have trauma from sexual violence, and I have
Mm-hmm.
trauma from abuse.
Me
And
too.
yeah, yeah, fun club. Um, but I also have educational trauma, and I could have students come up and tell me some really horrific abuse that they had been through, and because I had been through so much therapy around sexual violence, I could hear any of that and be like, okay, here's our plan. And I would not get triggered usually. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I would go home a really hard time, but I would be fine. But when I would see the way that kids with ADHD are still treated, because I hadn't done as much work around that, if I saw a kid with ADHD being talked to in the way that I was talked to,
Mm-hmm.
which assumes that ADHD is a moral failing and not a neurodevelopmental disorder,
Yes.
um, I would get triggered. I would really kind of be like steam coming out of my ears, and I'd be like, don't you talk to them like that. And so I really, centered a lot of my work as well around like catching up with even the students with ADHD who weren't in my classes, and trying to make sure that there was somebody that they knew I had it too, and that they
Mm-hmm.
knew somebody they could come talk to, and that I educated them about the things that I didn't know about ADHD, so that they wouldn't be internalizing it as if they
Mm-hmm.
were having a moral failing, the way that I did. And I think that is, it all ties in. It ties into the idea of having access, if you've been abused, to therapy and
Mm-hmm.
to safe teachers and to people who can recognize that you're not just trying to make their lives miserable,
Yeah.
you're going through something, And there's a huge push in the educational community to recognize those things and to create more education and more of a space for that, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And at the same time, there's also this other push coming from the other direction of just defunding schools and creating charter schools that can inflate statistics and send out, you know, they can make it really difficult for kids who don't have generational wealth um, to attend, you know,
Yeah.
don't have to provide special education resources. They're not legally held to the same standards, and they have a lot of political power. So they're, in my opinion, and I'm not an expert, but in my opinion, they are working directly against those that equity piece,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of access for to therapy for kids who have trauma and disabilities. You know.
Oh, I could talk to you all day, all day.
Okay,
Gonna
let's do
kick us off in it's gonna kick us off in a few, but like in
it.
a minute. So I want to make sure that I say thank you before it does, and I hope that you will. I want to continue this conversation, so I want to do it again, and because I think it's very necessary in this time to discuss this openly. So I just want
Mhm.
to say thank you for joining me and getting up in the morning and having a heavy conversation.
Yeah, you know I'm always down to get up in the morning. It's fine.
Yay. Well, I'm going to jump off because it says we have 10 seconds,
All
but
right.
we're going to do
Thank
this
you for,
again, Lauren. I love you.
okay.
I love you. Mwah. Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.
Yes, thank you for joining.